Good evening, YouTube people. It's been a while since I've come on channel, and I think it's time that I should make this a regular thing. So that's what I'm doing now. I also, you know, just as an update, I see, yes, I grew a beard. I want to get your opinion as to whether I look good, better with or without this beard. But that's not the primary focus of my personal facial hair is not exactly the purpose of this video, but rather I want to share with you a health journey that I'm taking. I recently started something called the carnivore diet. Now you're probably thinking, Larry, why? I mean, isn't eating meat primarily or only a dangerous thing? That is a myth that has been disproven many times. But a lot of the powers that be want us to believe that we should only have a plant-based diet or adhere to the standard American diet, which has been basically slowly killing our society nutritionally for the past 50 years. Why do I say that? Think about it. Back in, let's say, the 50s and the 40s, 50s, maybe the early 60s, people were much healthier than they are today. How so? Diabetes was maybe 5% of the population. Usually type 1 diabetes, and type 2 is usually adult onset. Today, diabetes is like 50 to 75% of the world's population in this country alone. And why is that? Well, for one thing, our diet has become rather poor. There was a famous study done back in the late 60s called the 7-country study, uh, coordinated by a man by the name of Ansel Keys. And I'll say doctor in quotes because he wasn't really a true scientist. In fact, he was probably paid by the major food companies. And the reason I say that is the, the study started out with 22 countries, but he was looking to prove a specific point that saturated fats, animal fats, um, which are saturated, and the kind of diet that we had back in the day was a cause of heart disease and was totally unhealthy, and was touting the benefits of a higher carb, lower fat diet, and how a plant based diet was much better, although the standard American diet is more chemical based. But I'll get into that later. What happened was the 15 countries that were kicked out of the study were basically disproving the very hypothesis that Ansel Keys was trying to promote and was getting paid for by the major food companies. And so when he came back, 7-country study, very flimsy evidence, a lot of epidemiological research more than anything else. He set out to prove that dietary fat and cholesterol the cause of health problems. So as time progressed and his theories were being promoted by by the powers that be at the time, there was I think it was Lyndon Johnson that was having having a heart attack, and his doctor, who was a very big advocate of Ansel Keys, he basically said that his cardiologist was promoting and saying and touting the benefits and the efficacy of results in Ansel Keys' study, and said that saturated fat and cholesterol was, in fact, the enemy. There was no real scientific evidence to prove that hypothesis. But the diet heart hypothesis, and remember, it's always been just a hypothesis, there was never any proof. The diet heart hypothesis has been prevalent throughout not only this country, but other industrialized countries for the past 50 plus years. As a result, let's take a look at the overall health of the United States since this was promoted. First off, in this hypothesis was saying that we should cut out, eliminate, or drastically reduce the amount of cholesterol we consume in our daily diet. Reduce fat, cut down on meat proteins. But when you reduce fat, what are you left with? You're left with carbohydrates. And they created this food pyramid that basically had on the bottom bread, pasta, potatoes, and all of the high carb foods that are out there. Have 70%, 60 to 70% of your calories in carbohydrates. Whole wheat and whole grains. Then go a step up, you got fruits and vegetables. You go up a little higher, then you can put a little bit of the protein. Milk, some meat, fish, dairy, a little bit, and then on top you put, fats and sweets and things like that. And this has been the prevalent way of eating as a result of his political clout, financial support, especially from big food and big pharma. And what's interesting to note is that a lot of the processed food companies were reformulating much of what they had. Crisco oil, for example, cooking oils, instead of using saturated fat like olive oil, uh, coconut oil, things like that, butter was replaced by margarine. and because it was supposed because butter fat was considered to be bad, and high quantities of omega 6 fatty acids versus the omega 3s, which are highly inflammatory. A lot of highly polyunsaturated fats have been replacing the saturated and some of the monounsaturated. The unsaturated fats are poly and mono, and like the also called the MUFAs and the PUFAs, which, if you think about it, sounds like an old um, music group called the Mamas and the Papas. But Crisco Wesson was highly advertised. We have we've also been they've also reformulated Nabisco, for example, Keebler, other companies that make processed snack cakes. And they took lard and anything with saturated fat out and put it instead the polyunsaturated vegetable and seed oils into the mix, and which also increased sales because because there was an Orthodox Jewish population that didn't buy things like Oreo cookies or Fig Newtons or any of those particular snack cakes because they had non-kosher fats in them, and you know the highly the lard and ingredients like that. So they added in certain chemicals, and they also added in they substituted vegetable and seed oils, cottonseed oil, vegetables, soybean oil, and these were actually industrial, and these kinds of oils were never meant to be foods. These were industrial oils that were lubricating, machinery. And a lot of these vegetable and seed oils have no vegetables or seeds in them, which is kind of ironic. But these were industrialized oils. Then you have, all right, now, why is this so important? And why? Look at the actors in the movies from the 40s, the 50s, maybe even the 60s, maybe even back in the 20s. We had a much different diet back then. And people were in better shape. They were much leaner, um, and much more agile than the average American is today. But even more so, you look at the disease rates, metabolic disease rates, which is metabolic syndrome, which is basically insulin resistance, which which is a precursor to prediabetes, diabetes, uh, which of course is metabolic, and then you have all of the heart problems associated with heart attacks, strokes, and even dementia. Alzheimer's disease, according to the Mayo Clinic, has been classified as type 3 diabetes. Why? the excess glucose going to the brain is been given. I didn't know this. If I had known this uh, back in 2017, 2018, probably could have been able to save my mom's life. She was suffering from Alzheimer's, and, and her way of eating when she was debilitating in her health, always wanted ice cream. And most of what she would eat on a daily basis would have been ice cream, ice cream, ice cream. Yet when she was raising myself and my brother, ice cream was an occasional treat, not a way of life. And we make dietary choices all the time. And what's interesting to note is that when you make a choice like that, and as a dutiful son, I would go out and buy ice cream for her and give it to her. But I also saw that she was getting dehydrated a lot of times, and I saw that she was debilitating. And learning, if I had known now then what I know now, I would have basically put her on some semblance of a carnivore diet. Why? Because cholesterol, I find, is something that the body manufactures, both in the brain and in the and throughout the body. And my journey for the past, I would say, few weeks has been primarily doing the carnivore diet. And I'm going to basically keep you posted as far as my blood levels and whatnot. And one of the things I've learned is that dietary cholesterol does not clog your arteries. I'm not saying that cholesterol doesn't get into the arteries, but there are other factors involved. People back in the earlier days, back in the 40s, 50s, uh, even in the 30s, people had less cholesterol. People were much thinner. People were healthier. Yet there was a higher fat content in the diet. Why is that? Well, with Ansel Keys' study, beforehand, diabetes was maybe 5% of the country. Today, it's over 50% and climbing. Heart attacks are more frequent. In fact, heart disease back then was maybe 5-10%, less than 10%. Today, it's the leading killer of people here in America, male and female. When you go to the doctor and he gets worried about your cholesterol, and he puts you on a statin drug, which is the worst thing in the world, by the way. Why? As I said earlier, the body manufactures cholesterol, and the body manufactures cholesterol. Why would the body make something that's dangerous for itself? Doesn't make sense. And the Inuit and the Maasai, the Inuit up in the Arctic area of Canada, and the Maasai tribe down in the African area, they subsist on a mostly carnivorous diet because where they live, there's very little vegetation. Yet heart disease and heart disease and diabetes is practically unheard of, and yet they do live a good, healthy life. What about, and today, diabetes went from being 5% in those earlier days, those earlier decades, to well over 50%, maybe even 75%. People are being more and more people are being diagnosed with diabetes. And diabetes, as is, you know, kills you slowly. That's what Because what happens is it's caused by our diet. We eat so much carbohydrates using the standard American diet that the carbs turn to sugar, especially from grains. And the glucose, stimulates the pancreas to create more and more insulin. And it overworks the pancreas and create all that insulin. And the cells become resistant and become what insulin resistant. Think of it this way. You move into a neighborhood and you have 100 people and you have like 100 neighbors bringing you a cake to welcome you to the neighborhood. Now, 100 cakes coming into your house is a lot. You say thank you, that's very nice, and you call it a day. But imagine all those 100 people coming and bringing you a cake every hour of every day for an entire week or even a month. Your house is going to be so filled with cake, you're going to be neighbor resistant. That's exactly what happens with cells and insulin resistance. Insulin brings the glucose into the cells. Now the mitochondria in the cells need the glucose as a form of energy, but there's just so much energy it could store. And insulin is a storage hormone. It doesn't allow you to burn the sugar in the cells properly. As a result, more and more. And when you keep eating sugar, when you keep eating carbs, whether it be from a candy bar or from a loaf of bread or from whatever, you, the pancreas doesn't know because sugar is sugar is sugar. It doesn't matter if it's table sugar or fruit sugar. Well, fruit sugar is fructose, and that goes to the liver. But for the most part, but it still stimulates high insulin production. And then you got so much of an abundance of insulin, which of course will have insulin resistance. Now, a lot of times when the blood sugar spikes up, sometimes the doctor will or nurse will come in and shoot you with more insulin, exogenous insulin, even though you've got plenty of natural insulin that hasn't been able to put all the glucose into the cells. That's the last thing. What you need to do is basically cut back on the carbs, cut sugar so that the insulin can do its job properly, and at the same time, you'll be able to start burning the fat that's there, burning the sugar that's there. Because otherwise, the more insulin goes into the cells, and the more and goes around the cells, that'll choke vital organs, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and nerves in the legs and feet. Right now, I have a slight touch of neuropathy in my feet. But you also need to insulin. But my brother's father-in-law had diabetes and he went blind. I know a couple of people that lost limbs due to diabetes. One guy that went to rehab in a nursing home that I've been involved with lost lost half his leg to diabetes, had to get it amputated. Another guy I know got his toes amputated because of diabetes. I like my feet. I want to keep them. But what's interesting to note is that all of this could have been prevented. Now, getting back to my mom and her Alzheimer's, she passed away unfortunately back in April, March of 2018, pre-COVID. But what happened there is that the ice, eating all that ice cream and all that sugar and stuff built up, more sugar, and the, we couldn't really fight off the Alzheimer's, and so she went through hospice. Had I known then what I know now, I would have been more adamant about working a dietary change versus just accepting the medications by themselves. Seeing the rock of the family deteriorate was very eye-opening. So what happened was, what happens now, what about, so what to do? If you reduce the carbohydrates that you take in and reduce other inflammatories. Now I was doing a ketogenic diet for a while and I lost basically 60 pounds in the span of less than a year. Amazing, amazing, right? And I went through a little bit of a stall and I realized that I was still eating certain things that I shouldn't be eating, and there are certain things that are kind of inflammatory. So what I did was I just simply said, okay, fine. After looking at videos, YouTubes from Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Fung, um, Dr. Ovadia, uh, Dr. Anthony Chafee, he's one of my favorites, Dr. Sean Baker, and I realized, and also Kerry, look at he was doing a documentary called Healing Humanity, Guide to a Proper Human Diet, and Dr. Berry considers the carnivore or ketogenic diets proper human diet because we've been carnivore for the first million years of human existence. Not a lot of people know that. Now, but you say, Larry, isn't it difficult to adhere to a carnivore diet, especially if you're an Orthodox Jew? Yeah, not really. As long as I steer clear of pork and shellfish, and certain parts of the meat, I'm fine. In keeping with the laws of kosher. At the same time, eggs, poultry, fish, meat primarily, and that includes organ meats. I've actually developed a taste all the time, but I usually take ground beef, put it in with cook it as a hamburger, chop it up, cook it with some scrambled eggs. It's a perfect meal. I went to a dinner party, and the hostess, when I told her what she saw that I dropped some weight, and she says to me, and I told her that I was starting this carnivore diet, and she told me that was dangerous because conventional wisdom says that you need a balanced diet, and yet You look at the people that have gone carnivore, and they're helped tremendously. So I'm going to work on this. I'll let you know how it works out. I'll even I'll even try to put some of my own blood work up on YouTube just to show you how, by comparison, what I do now versus what I did later, what I'm doing later on. And too many people have been showing clearer skin, increased energy, and overall better moods, better. Now, when I started the keto part of my journey, there was a little bit of keto flu because you're basically cutting down the carbs. But people think if you don't eat carbs, you're going to be nutrient deficient. Not so. The body makes glucose in and of itself with something called through the liver, and breaks down some of the proteins to produce glucose called gluconeogenesis. There are no deficiencies caused by lack of carbohydrates. You're not going to die by not eating carbs. In fact, you might even live longer. Now, am I eating more cholesterol in my diet, more saturated fats, more monounsaturated fats? Yes. Is that going to clog my arteries? The answer is no. Why? Because the relation between dietary cholesterol and clogging arteries has been disproven many. In fact, people that started the carnivore diet, there was a slight increase in the cholesterol, including the LDL, and then the cholesterol went down. Plus, what about the French paradox? What's the French paradox? The French paradox is that the French eat a lot of high saturated fat. In fact, goose pate or pate de foie gras, which is basically goose liver, where they force feed carbohydrates to the goose to the point where the liver swells up and puts a lot of fat in the liver, and then makes it very fatty. And then they kill the goose, and the liver is high in saturated fat. And there's other high fat foods that are eaten by the French. Yet their rate of heart disease is maybe a fifth of what it is here in America. Why is that? Excuse me, not a fifth, maybe 5%. Why? They're eating a lot of high cholesterol foods, yet their rates of heart disease are less by comparison. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we've been lied to. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe, like I say, our doctors, most of them earnestly want to help us, want to treat us properly and give us proper care. But there's a lot of money to be made by keeping us sick. The drug companies don't want us to know these things because if we start treating our ailments with diet, it reduces our need for pharmaceuticals. And instead of being dependent on those drugs for the rest of our lives, we start knocking that cuts into the profits of big pharma. The food companies, processed food companies, which give us the cakes and even the so-called lunches, the impossible burgers, the other processed foods that we are used to eating all the time. We stop eating processed foods, it cuts into the profits of the big food companies. We just eat natural, whole foods. Now, are grains good for you? There's there's debate about that. I find that there's too much sugar in grains. Lower the sweeteners. But lately, I've been with my newfound energy. I doing more exercise. I've been having better results with my blood sugar. My blood pressure is still a little high, but I figure if I keep at this pace and avoid processed foods and avoid, I hate to say it, but fruits and vegetables. I love. There's a lot of fruits that I really miss. Would I reintroduce them back into my diet after a few months? Maybe, but see what happens. I'm gonna later on put some links into the show notes that will give us you know to some of the people that I mentioned. Uh, Check out Kent Carnivore. Check out Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Sean Baker, and also type in healing humanity. I have a feeling that you're going to see a lot of benefits to you know because these are people that I respect. But check with your own doctor as well, and you may learn a few things. I would also recommend Common Sense Labs, written by Dr. Ken Berry and another author. I forget his name at the moment. But he also wrote a book, become a bestseller, Lies My Doctor Told Me. Check that out. And of course, Dr. Philip Ovadia, Stay Off My Operating Table. Now, this is a cardiologist, and he advocates a carnivore diet. I brought my wife to a cardiologist, not Dr. Ovadia, of course, but he's still from the old. But that particular doctor is from the old school and says you shouldn't have a meat only diet. But he straight answer as to why he doesn't. I guess at his age and his old school philosophy is that he's too old to learn anything. When you have someone who believes that he knows more, or there's no more for him to learn, time to go to another doctor. Personal opinion, but it's always good to have a second opinion because even the most experienced physicians and the most knowledgeable physicians will still be on two separate ends of the spectrum, and they'll disagree on a lot of major points. You you take the good and the bad from each point of view, because there's no such thing as one size fits all when it comes to health. As always, stay powerful and unleash your powerful self.